Good day, everyone. I am Lei Ravelo, senior reporter for Devex, and I am here with us today, Miss Helen Clark, former Prime Minister of New Zealand and the co-chair of the Independent Panel for Pandemic Preparedness, Prevention, and Response. Um, Helen, hi, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Well, today we'll be talking about really the recommendations of the independent panel. Everyone's been talking about it since it was published. And I would like to just touch on a little bit on some of the headline grabbing recommendations of the panel. Um, I guess this is a start. Um, Helen, can you tell us what gaps will the one of the recommendations was was having a global threats council. Can you tell us about this council? What gaps will this council fill in global health security, and how do you see it working with WHO?
The idea is to lift the attention that pandemic preparedness and response gets up to the level of attention that we give other very significant global challenges. It's well known, for example, that the Security Council was set up to address peace and security threats. You have a lot of leader level attention in summits like climate change or any range of things. But global health preparedness and response for pandemics has tended to be dealt with at a ministerial level, at the World Health Assembly, and then in national governments, often at quite a low level. Very few countries, I think, their citizens could identify who the international health regulations focal point is for their country. Now, look, we just haven't had enough high level attention to the issues until, of course, a pandemic strikes and we go into overdrive to try to deal with it and overcome the deficiencies of there not having been a coordinated, concerted effort to lift preparedness and response mechanisms everywhere. So we're presenting a package of recommendations, but a very important part of that package is to construct what is really a high-level oversight, monitoring, and accountability council at head of state level, and also including representatives of civil society and private sector, to hold people accountable, hold countries accountable, hold international organizations accountable for all doing their bit to see that preparedness is in place and response mechanisms are in place. We're all in this together. If any one country falters in trying to combat an outbreak or a pandemic, the rest of us, one way or another, will pay for it. We've got off, in a way likely with diseases like Ebola, which didn't spread so much out of narrowly confined geographical areas. And maybe we've got complacent as a world. But what COVID shows us is that the system's broken. The status quo can't fix the problem. We have to lift this up to leader level, both at the national government level, and we make recommendations about that, but also at the global level. So that's the point of the council. Now, when people say to me, well, how about WHO? Isn't it doing its job? Absolutely not, because the council is not an operational body. As I said, oversight, monitoring, accountability. And I think it can be tremendously helpful to WHO. In our report, we say that WHO needs to now set very clear targets and benchmarks for countries to reach in order to achieve a satisfactory level of preparedness and response. We say that country plans should now systematically be subject to a universal peer periodic review mechanism. The Global Council is there to help that and champion that and support WHO to exhort countries to get the results we need as a world. Remember, WHO has no power to enforce a country to do any of these things. It can give guidelines, technical guidance, it can exhort, but the council as a high-level accountability body can really shine a spotlight on what's happening and what isn't. And I hope get a healthy dynamic going among countries so that countries will want to compete, to be seen to be really prepared. So that's the thinking behind the council, not to let these issues languish, if you like, at the level of Minister of Health and focal points and so on, but lift it up so it gets attention from the leadership level. My last point would be, I've been a leader of my country for 9 years. I know, what leadership's about. I've also been a health minister. With all humility, I can say that as health minister, I was far from being the most powerful minister in my government. So I know that to really get something moving at the national level, you need leaders focused on it. And to get it moving at the global level, you need to bring leaders in. It can't be dealt with satisfactorily at a ministerial level.
That was interesting when you mentioned you bringing this to the highest level of government's attention. How would you respond to concerns that this may weaken instead of, strengthening WHO?
WHO's role is indispensable, but it needs help and it needs advocacy. In many ways, when you look at this pandemic, WHO was left to struggle pretty much on its own, and it didn't have the tools that it needed. We have observed in our report that the international health regulations are very defensive and quite limited, and often more of a hindrance than a help to WHO in getting on and doing the job that needs to be done. For example, WHO has no right under existing legal instruments to demand access to a country and get it to go and inspect an outbreak. It has no right to publish information it has from a country without the country's permission. It feels very constrained in using a precautionary approach in alerting the world because the IHR require this cautious verification and so on. We're saying, for heaven's sake, this is the 21st century. This is not the Middle Ages when an infectious pathogen traveled on foot and by donkey with people. This is an era where we're highly globally interconnected. And if you see even a hint of a respiratory pathogen with pandemic potential on the loose, you need to start alerting pretty early. And we found the procedures just were not conducive to that. So everything we are saying is supportive of WHO being empowered to do its job and having high-level advocacy for it, like the Global Health Threats Council, to support it to get countries to do what they need to do.
You mentioned about WHO being constrained in applying the precautionary principle, and this is one of the things that people have been talking about with the panel's recommendation. I'd like to ask, what does applying the precautionary principle mean, and what are the challenges you foresee, going forward?
So what you don't want is a situation where WHO is crying wolf every other day. Look, my understanding is that the WHO's emergency program and surveillance and alert people, they're scanning the world all the time. There's lots of sources of information coming in about, here's evidence of a new disease somewhere. And to pick the one that's going to take off is obviously, quite a task. But what we say is that where it's a respiratory pathogen, this is in a category of its own. And you can't wait for evidence of human-to-human transmission. You should act as if it's highly likely and begin alerting the world to that. We've also said that around the declaration of the public health emergency of international concern, there need to be very clear, objective and transparent and publicly available criteria. To our panel, it's a complete mystery why the emergency committee constituted under the international health regulations did not recommend calling this a public health emergency of international concern on the 22nd of January. 2 days before, one of China's most senior scientists had pronounced that there was human-to-human transmission. And still, there was no declaration of a public health emergency of international concern. So I think it also needs to be made very clear that while, of course, it's useful to convene an emergency committee under the international health regulations, the Director General in the end has the power to declare an emergency. And that was justified on the 22nd of January. In the event, it was 8 days later. And you can see from the series of delays that built up from the time the cluster of cases of pneumonia of unknown origin was identified, that there were days and weeks of delay which delayed the public health emergency of international concern being declared. We are very concerned about that. Now, let me make one other point. We think that could be fixed by empowering WHO, by putting into a new pandemic framework convention more explicit language about the responsibilities of states and international organizations of filling gaps in the framework. But here's the rub. When the public health emergency of international concern was declared, most countries didn't do very much. So much as we have identified that period in January as being one when things were slow to move and where the IHR were a hindrance, not a help, we then look at February and put our head in our hands because too few countries did much. It was almost as if they were watching what was happening in Wuhan as if it was on Mars and wouldn't happen to them, forgetting that we're so globally connected. If we'd used February better, we wouldn't have been in the mess we were in by March. And so again, reinforcing WHO so that the world knows when WHO declares a public health emergency of international concern, you better jump, because if you don't, the COVID experience shows us what can happen. You have to be ready. You have to go on the front foot with actually aggressive measures put in place to avert this turning into a pandemic. And the world was too slow.
I think one follow-up, you mentioned about the pandemic convention. I remember, the panel's call was really to have this in 6 months. There now is some sort of debate happening whether to have it and how can it really change, the situation next time we have a crisis. What's your take on all of this, different discussions?
If not now, when? Clearly, the international legal instruments we have and the regulations are insufficient. So a pandemic convention which fills the gaps and is very clear about the responsibilities of states and international organizations is needed. Now, as to the time frame, we have likened the COVID-19 catastrophe to the Chernobyl moment in nuclear safety. And then we look at what happened with the Chernobyl moment of a major nuclear accident with spillover impacts across borders. Within 5 months of Chernobyl, there were 2 new treaties on nuclear safety within 5 months. And our challenge to the World Health Assembly is move on. You have Article 19 of WHO Constitution, which allows for these framework conventions to be negotiated. When I was a young health minister, I went more than 30 years ago to WHO to advocate for the Framework Convention on Tobacco, which took too long. This one needs to be done now. Seize the momentum while the leaders of the world are focused on this, focused on what could we do to stop it next time. Get these important building blocks in place. The Global Council, the new convention, the financing mechanisms, a redesigned Act A type platform. There's so many things that can be done. And if we don't do it now, when on earth will we? We can't count on the next global pandemic taking 102 years to come around. Could be next month, could not be. But we're not ready. We weren't ready for this one. And we need to get the institutions and mechanisms in place to make us ready.
There is huge interest right now with the convention or treaty as they're calling it, and I'm sure this will be taken up at the World Health Assembly. Well, I don't think we have much time, but thank you so much, Helen, for sharing your insights on the panel's recommendations.